What if I told you that for nearly 200 years, thousands of people from across Europe left their families, their jobs, everything they knew, and marched toward a land they'd never seen, a land halfway across the world, fighting and dying for the promise of eternal salvation? And what if I told you they did this not once, not twice, but at least 9 separate times? Welcome to the Crusades, one of the most misunderstood, wildly ambitious, and honestly kind of insane periods in human history. Today we're going to unpack what the Crusades actually were, why they started, what happened across all those campaigns, and ultimately why they stopped. This is What Is, and let's get into it. Definition. First things first, what exactly is a crusade? A crusade, at its core, was a military campaign sanctioned by the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, with the stated goal of reclaiming the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, from Muslim rule. But here's where it gets interesting. The term crusade actually comes from the Latin word crux, meaning cross. Crusaders were supposed to be taking up the cross as a symbol of their commitment to fight for Christianity. Now here's a fact that might surprise you. The word crusade itself wasn't commonly used during the actual events. People back then said taking the cross or going on an expedition to the east. The term crusade as we know it, that came later in the 1700s. So technically, the people living through it never called themselves crusaders. History has a way of naming things after the fact, but what made these campaigns so unique wasn't just the military aspect. When the Pope called for a crusade, he wasn't just asking volunteers, he was offering some pretty extraordinary incentives. And by extraordinary, I mean get out of hell free cards, medieval style. Pope Urban II, the guy who kicked off the whole thing in 1095, offered something called a plenary indulgence. That meant if you died while fighting in a crusade, all your sins would be forgiven. Not just some sins, all of them. Every bad thing you'd ever done, gone. Instant ticket to heaven. No questions asked. Now if you're sitting there thinking, wait, that sounds like an extreme sales pitch, you're not wrong. It absolutely was. The church had found its ultimate incentive program. Fight for God, die for God, and boom, you're guaranteed eternal salvation. What a deal, right? But here's where it gets complicated. The definition of crusade has actually been debated by historians for decades. Some say it only applies to the campaigns to the Holy Land. Others argue it should include campaigns against heretics in Europe, or even wars against pagan peoples in Eastern Europe. It's one of those historical terms where the boundaries are a bit fuzzy. For the sake of clarity, today we're focusing on the big ones, the campaigns to the Holy Land that most people mean when they say the Crusades. But it's worth knowing there were also plenty of other crusades happening simultaneously, because apparently medieval Europe had a lot of fighting energy to expend. Origins. So why did this all start? What would possess thousands of people to leave their homes and march toward a distant land they'd probably never see? The short answer: religion, politics, and honestly, a whole lot of frustration. Let's rewind to the 11th century. Europe was not great, honestly. Feudalism was in full swing, which meant society was basically a giant pyramid of people owing things to other people. Kings answered to no one, peasants worked the land, and owed their lords just about everything. And the Pope in Rome was trying to exert spiritual authority over a continent that was, frankly, a mess. But here's what changed everything. In 1054, the Christian church split in two. The Eastern Orthodox Church based in Constantinople, that's modern-day Istanbul, and the Roman Catholic Church in Rome went their separate ways. This is called the Great Schism, and it created a massive divide, literally and figuratively, between Christian East and Christian West. Now Constantinople was a massive, wealthy, sophisticated city, the kind of place that made medieval European cities look like small towns. It was the gateway to the East, and it had been holding the line against Muslim expansion for centuries. But by the late 1000s, things were getting dicey. The Seljuk Turks, a powerful Muslim dynasty, had been expanding aggressively, and had recently dealt the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire basically, a serious defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, was in trouble, so he did something that would change history. He reached out to the Pope in Rome for help. He asked for military aid against the Muslims threatening his empire. Enter Pope Urban II. Now, Urban was a clever guy. He saw an opportunity here, not just to help fellow Christians, which was certainly part of the motivation, but also to accomplish several other goals. First, he wanted to reunite the split Christian church, bring the Eastern Orthodox back under the Roman Catholic umbrella. That had been a dream of popes for generations. Second, he wanted to redirect all that feudal violence in Europe inward and outward in a controlled way. You see, feudal lords were constantly fighting each other, and the Pope wanted peace, sort of. He figured if you give knights a common enemy overseas, they might stop raiding churches and fighting their neighbors. Third, and perhaps most importantly, he wanted to increase the Pope's power and influence. A successful crusade would be an enormous prestige win for the papacy. So in 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II gave a speech that would echo through history. Now, we don't have the actual transcript. We're relying on accounts written years later. But the general message was something like this: Christian brothers, the Turks are attacking our Eastern Christian brothers. The holy places where Christ walked are in Muslim hands. We must go and take them back. God wills it. And here's where it gets almost comical. The response was overwhelming. People, regular people, not just knights, started signing up in droves. There was a guy called Peter the Hermit who basically started his own unofficial crusade before the official one even launched. He led a ragtag army of peasants and poor folks toward the Holy Land, and it was an absolute disaster. Most of them died before they even got there. But the enthusiasm was undeniable. In 1096, the real Crusaders started mobilizing. Knights, soldiers, and their followers began the long march eastward. They went by land through the Byzantine Empire, then down into the Holy Land, and the rest, as they say, is history. The First Crusade launched in 1096 and reached Jerusalem in 1099. And here's something wild. They actually succeeded. They captured Jerusalem, established several Crusader states, and for a while, it looked like the whole thing might actually work. But of course, history is never that simple. If you're finding this interesting, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. We explore all kinds of historical topics here on What Is? Things you learned in school, things you never learned, and things that might surprise you. So stick around, because we're just getting to the good part. Now let's talk about Overview of the Crusades. So just how many Crusades were there? Here's where it gets a little confusing, because the answer depends on how you're counting. Historians generally agree there were somewhere between 8 and 10 major crusades to the Holy Land, plus countless smaller ones. Let's walk through the main ones. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. This is the big one, the original, the one that started it all. And honestly, it was the most successful. In 1099, after a grueling 2-year campaign, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. And here's where things got dark. When they took the city, they basically slaughtered a lot of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. It's one of those historical facts that isn't pretty, but it's important to acknowledge. This was medieval warfare, and take no prisoners was unfortunately common practice. But they did establish the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. These would exist in some form for nearly 200 years. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149. About 40 years later, the Crusader states were in trouble. The Muslims were regrouping under a new leader, Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul. He captured Edessa in 1144, and the West panicked. Pope Eugene III called for a new crusade, and this time some big names got involved. King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. But here's the thing, it was a total disaster. They barely accomplished anything. The Germans got decimated in Anatolia, and the French basically gave up. No Jerusalem capture, no meaningful territorial gains, just a whole lot of dead people. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Now this one is famous. You've probably heard of Richard the Lionheart, King Richard I of England. He was one of the big leaders of the Third Crusade, along with Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire and King Philip II of France. The trigger was the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, a legendary Muslim leader who had unified the Islamic forces. The crusade to reclaim the Holy City was hugely significant, and Richard actually got pretty close. He negotiated, fought, and eventually secured a treaty that allowed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem, even though the city remained under Muslim control. Barbarossa, unfortunately, drowned in a river in Anatolia before he even reached the Holy Land. Philip went home early, but Richard, he became a legend, even if he didn't technically win. The Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204. Here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean completely sideways. This crusade was supposed to go to Egypt first, then up to the Holy Land. But there was a problem. They didn't have enough money to pay for their ships, so they made a deal with the Venetians. Help us build the ships, and we'll give you a share of the plunder. But here's what happened. They got waylaid in Constantinople. Remember that Eastern Christian capital I mentioned earlier? They ended up sacking Constantinople in 1204, which was supposed to be a Christian city. They stole countless treasures, including the famous bronze horses that now sit in Venice's St. Mark's Square. You can go see them right now. This was a massive scandal. The Pope had called for a crusade to the Holy Land, and instead Christian knights sacked the greatest Christian city in the world. It basically shattered any remaining unity between Eastern and Western Christians. And honestly, this is one of those moments where you have to wonder what any of it was, even for any more. The 5th through 7th Crusades, 1217 to 1270. These get progressively more desperate and less successful. The 5th Crusade tried to attack Egypt. The 6th was led by Emperor Frederick II, who was excommunicated before he even left. He still went, and somehow negotiated Jerusalem back without fighting. A diplomatic miracle that lasted about 15 years. The 7th Crusade was led by King Louis IX of France, who got captured in Egypt and had to pay a huge ransom. By this point, the Crusader states were hanging on by a thread. The 8th and 9th Crusades, 1270 to 1272. The last two Crusades were almost sad. The 8th, led by, you guessed it, King Louis IX again, targeted Tunis in North Africa. He died there. The 9th was a half-hearted attempt by Edward I of England that accomplished essentially nothing. And then it was over. The last Crusader stronghold, Acre, fell in 1291. The Mamluks, a Muslim dynasty based in Egypt, took the city, and that was it. The Crusader states were done. Almost 200 years of crusading, and it was all over. Why they ended. So why did the Crusades stop? There's no single answer. It's a combination of factors that built up over time. Reason 1. They failed. This seems obvious, but it's important. The Crusades, as a military endeavor to permanently hold the Holy Land, were essentially a failure. After nearly 200 years, the Crusader states were gone. Jerusalem was back under Muslim control. All that fighting, all those lives lost, and what did they have to show for it? A whole lot of graves and some cool castles in disrepair. The dream of a permanent Christian presence in the Holy Land simply didn't pan out. And after enough failures, people started questioning whether it was worth continuing. Reason 2. The Church lost power. Here's something interesting. As the Crusades progressed, the popes started losing some of their grip on the whole thing. The Crusades had always been about the Pope's authority, but as time went on, monarchs started pursuing their own interests. They didn't always follow the Pope's calls, and sometimes they outright ignored them. Also, the papacy itself went through some rough times. There was that whole period with multiple popes claiming to be the real Pope, the Western Schism. When you can't even agree on who's in charge of the church, it's kind of hard to rally people for a holy war. Reason 3. New threats emerged. The world was changing. The Mongol Empire was sweeping across Asia, which disrupted old trade routes and shifted power dynamics. The Ottoman Turks were rising in Anatolia, which would eventually become a huge problem for Europe. And honestly, by the 1300s, the Crusades just seemed less relevant. The original goal, helping the Byzantines, had become complicated because the Byzantines themselves were weakening. The Islamic world was also changing, becoming more organized under new dynasties. Reason 4. People got tired. This might be the simplest explanation, but it's also probably the most accurate. After 200 years, 9 major crusades, countless smaller campaigns, and millions of dead people, Europe was exhausted. The enthusiasm just wasn't there anymore. Also, the incentives started to lose their punch. The plenary indulgence was still a thing, but people were starting to think more critically about what the church was offering. The Black Death, which killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in the 1300s, kind of put things in perspective. If you were worried about eternal salvation, maybe getting through the plague was more immediate. Reason 5. The world moved on. Finally, the Crusades ended because they became irrelevant. New priorities emerged: the Renaissance, the printing press, the Reformation. Europe was transforming, and the idea of marching off to the Holy Land started to seem like a relic of a less enlightened age. The Crusades didn't end with a dramatic final battle or a grand treaty. They just faded. The last crusade was in 1272. The last major crusader city fell in 1291, and by the time anyone really noticed, it was over. Legacy and reflection. Now here's what I find fascinating. The Crusades didn't actually end the Christian presence in the Holy Land. Christian pilgrims still visited, the Franciscans maintained some presence in Jerusalem, and trade continued. The idea of the Crusades, the concept, never really went away either. Throughout history, people have invoked the Crusades for various purposes. During the colonial era, some European powers compared their expansion to the Crusades. In more modern times, the term has been weaponized, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, to describe conflicts in the Middle East. It's become a sort of shorthand for religious violence, though that's a massive oversimplification. The truth is, the Crusades were complicated. They were about religion, yes, but also about power, money, politics, and human ambition. They were launched with grand promises of glory and salvation, and they ended in failure and exhaustion. But they also left a lasting mark on the relationship between Christianity and Islam, on the development of European states, and on how we think about religious conflict today. It's a part of history we can't ignore, even if it's uncomfortable. And honestly, that's what history is all about. Learning from the past, even the parts that are hard to stomach. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Crusades, make sure to check out our other videos on What Is, where we tackle all kinds of topics: history, science, culture, you name it. There will be one on screen, and our history playlist is linked above. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this with anyone who loves a good historical story. Now I've saved the best for last. Here's your bonus fact, the one thing I promised at the beginning that might just blow your mind. Bonus fact. Here's something that almost no one knows. During the Crusades, there was actually a period where Muslim and Christian forces briefly allied against a common enemy, and it had nothing to do with religion. During the Fifth Crusade in the early 1200s, the Crusaders made a deal with the Khwarezmian Turks, a Muslim group that was enemies of the Ayyubids, the dynasty controlling Egypt at the time. They coordinated attacks, shared intelligence, and even fought side by side. It didn't last long, and it wasn't exactly publicized, but it happened. and there's evidence that some of the Crusader knights actually converts to Islam and stayed in the Holy Land after the Crusades ended. They integrated into local society, adopted Muslim names, and simply stayed. The Crusades weren't just a story of black and white, good versus evil. They were messy, complicated, and deeply human. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. What would you do if a war lasted for 30 years? You didn't miss here. 30 whole years. Imagine being born in 1618, the same year this whole nightmare started, and living through it until 1648. You could have fought in battles, watched your village burn twice, maybe lost 3 different monarchs to the conflict, and still be alive when it finally ended. That's an entire generation of people who knew nothing but war. The 30 Years' War wasn't just long, it was absolutely catastrophic. Some historians estimate it killed somewhere between 8 and 12 million people. In Europe, in the early 1600s, that's roughly 15 to 20% of the entire population of Central Europe. Gone. Vanished. Just gone. What's wild is most people today have barely heard of it. If you mention World War I or World War II, everybody nods. But the 30 Years' War? It's like history's best kept terrible secret. So let's fix that. Today we're breaking down exactly what the 30 Years' War was, how it started, why it dragged on for so ridiculously long, and why, just why, it was so devastating that it changed European history forever. This is the story of the war that almost destroyed the continent. Let's go. The context: Europe in the early 1600s. To understand why this war happened, and why it went on so long, you need to understand what Europe looked like in 1618, and honestly, it was a mess. You've got hundreds of tiny principalities, dukedoms, bishoprics, and free imperial cities scattered across what is now Germany, all part of something called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire sounds impressive, like maybe it's one big powerful country. Nope. It was more like a really complicated family reunion where nobody agreed on anything. At the top was the emperor, but the emperor didn't really have much power. Below him were hundreds of princes who controlled their own little territories. They could pretty much do whatever they wanted, raise their own armies, collect their own taxes, and even make their own treaties with foreign powers. The emperor could whine about it, but good luck trying to enforce anything. And religion? Oh boy, this is where things get really complicated. By the early 1600s, you've got Catholics and Protestants living mixed together across the empire, not separated by geography, but just everywhere. Some territories are Catholic, some are Protestant, and a lot of them are what we'd call mixed. Families with Catholic uncles and Protestant cousins sitting around the same dinner table, trying not to start arguments. Now fast forward to 1555. That's the Peace of Augsburg. This was supposed to solve religious problems. The deal was simple. Cuius regio, ius religio. That's Latin for whose realm, his religion. Basically, whatever religion the local prince followed, that's what everyone in his territory had to follow too. No more arguments, easy solution, right? Wrong, because it's only covered Catholics and Lutherans. What about the Calvinists? The Anabaptists, the original Christians who hadn't gotten the memo. Nobody quite knew what to do with them, so tensions just kept building. This is the kindling. Small sparks everywhere, waiting for someone to light a match. The match that starts the fire. Bohemia, 1618. And here, friends, is our first proper setting. Prague, the capital of Bohemia. In 1618, Bohemia was part of the Habsburg Empire, the same family that held the imperial throne, and the current emperor was Matthias, who was, let's say, not in great health. He was old, he was sick, and he had no heir. This created a problem. Who would take over after Matthias dies? Enter Archduke Ferdinand of Styria. He later became Emperor Ferdinand II. Now, Ferdinand was deeply devoutly Catholic, And Bohemian nobles? Many of them were Protestant, very Protestant, and they were not happy about the prospect of Ferdinand becoming their new ruler. So on May 23, 1618, a group of Protestant nobles in Prague did something dramatic. They threw 2 Catholic governors and their secretary out of a window, high up, the 3rd floor actually. Did they die? Well, no, it wasn't that high, but they did land in a pile of manure, which is apparently softer than it sounds, and quite smelly, but they did survive. This wasn't about killing them. This was all about sending a message. The defenestration of Prague became the symbolic beginning of the war, and here's where we get our first real moment of dark comedy, everyone's reaction. The Protestant nobles declared war on the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs declared the Bohemian rebels traitors. Both sides started looking for allies, and because this was 1618 and nobody had learned anything yet, they started pulling in their neighbours, who pulled in their neighbours, who pulled in their neighbours. It was like the worst game of tag ever played. Within months, what started as a local Bohemian dispute turned into a full-blown conflict involving most of Europe's major powers. Spain, the Dutch Republic, Sweden, Denmark, France, all getting dragged in, one by one, and then all at once. This was the moment the 30 Years' War becomes everyone's problem. But before we dive deeper into phases of the war, let's pause here for a second. If you're enjoying this journey through history, if you're learning something new or just having fun, hit that like button. It really helps the channel and lets me know that you're with me for these deep dives. And if you want more content like this, more what is breakdowns of fascinating historical events, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Alright, back to the war. The phases of hell. Historians usually break the 30 Years' War into 4 major phases, or sometimes 5 depending on who's counting. Let's walk through them. Phase 1, the Bohemian Palatinate War, 1618 to 1623. After the defenestration, the Bohemian rebels picked Frederick V, Elector of the Palatinate, as their new king. He's the guy who'd later be called the Winter King, because he only lasted 1 winter before getting kicked out. Let's just say Ferdinand II did not take this well. He raised an army and crushed the Bohemians at the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620. Frederick fled. The Habsburgs executed the rebel leaders, and the Spanish, who were also Habsburgs, took the Palatinate for good measure. This phase is relatively short, but it sets everything up. The big European powers are now officially involved. Phase 2, the Danish phase, 1625 to 1629. Now enters Christian IV of Denmark. He's the King of Denmark and a Lutheran, and he's worried, very worried, that the Habsburgs are getting too powerful. So Christian IV joins the fight against the Habsburgs, backed by England, the Dutch Republic, and some Protestant German princes. This is the Danish phase, and it doesn't go well for the Danes. Here's where we meet the legendary general, Albrecht von Wallenstein. He's a weird guy, a warlord who raised his own private armies, a man who's more loyal to his soldiers than any particular cause. Under Wallenstein, the Habsburg forces actually win some decisive victories. By 1629, Denmark's out of the war. The Habsburgs seem unstoppable. But then things get complicated, because there's another player waiting in the wings, a much more dangerous one. Phase 3, the Swedish phase, 1630 to 1635. Enter Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, known as the Lion of the North. He's Swedish, he's Protestant, and he's got one of the best trained modern armies in Europe. In 1630, he lands in Germany with about 13,000 troops and starts making life very difficult for the Habsburgs. And you know what's kind of funny? In a theatre of war is absurd way, Gustavus Adolphus actually changes military history. He's one of the first generals to effectively use combined arms tactics. Infantry working with artillery and cavalry as one unified force. Before him, everyone basically stood in lines and fired at each other. He introduced mobile warfare. The Swedish phase is the bloodiest yet. Battles like Breitenfeld and Lutzen see tens of thousands killed. At Lutzen in 1632, Gustavus himself dies, from a gunshot to the mouth while leading the cavalry charge. No, seriously, that's how he goes. leading from the front, taking a bullet. By 1635, both sides are exhausted. They sign the Peace of Prague, a tentative truce that, well, doesn't hold, because by now the French have officially entered the war. And when France enters, you know this thing is just going nowhere fast. Phase 4, the French phase, 1635 to 1648. France is Catholic, but Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of France, could care less about religion. What he cares about is power, and the Habsburgs have too much of it. So France backs the Protestant side openly, pouring money and troops into the conflict. Now you've got this ridiculous situation, Catholic France fighting alongside Protestant Sweden against Catholic Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. The religious justification is completely gone. This is now just straight up power politics. And this is where the war becomes truly horrible, because there's no religious cause anymore. It's just endless campaigning, sieges, raids, and atrocities. There were many battles, like Le Croix in 1643, where the French beat the Spanish. A victory, but it didn't really end anything. The war kept grinding on. Finally, in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia was signed. It takes 5 separate treaties to make it work. One with Sweden, one with France, one with Spain, one with the Dutch, and one with the Imperial States. 30 years of murder and destruction, and it ends without anyone really winning. The borders change a little bit, but mostly it's just everyone agreeing to stop. Why was it so devastating? Alright, here's the question we've been building towards. Why was this war so unbelievably devastating? And there isn't just one answer. There are many. So let's break them down. Reason 1. Sheer duration. 30 years. That's 30 years of continuous warfare. Entire villages existed, grew up, and went to war without ever knowing peace. Generation after generation of young men fed into the meat grinder. Crops went unplanted because there was no one left to farm them. Families fled, came back, fled again. The psychological toll alone, the trauma of decades, passed down through families. Think about it this way. If this war started today, and at the time of recording it's 2026, the war would still be going in 2056. Or to put it another way, if this war had started in the year 2000, we would still be 4 years away from it ending. That's insane. Reason 2. Total warfare before total warfare was a term. Back then, wars were supposed to be fought between armies. You know, soldiers on one side, soldiers on the other. Citizens were not supposed to be targets. But the 30 Years' War didn't work that way. Armies survived by living off the land, which is a polite way of saying they'd march into a village, take everything, food, supplies, anything of value, and leave. Sometimes they'd burn the village behind them just to deny the resources to the enemy. Sometimes they'd just massacre everyone because why not? There's a term soldiers use, war maintaining itself. The armies were locusts. They'd sweep through an area, consume everything, and move on. And here's what's particularly awful. Plague followed the armies. Typhus, typhoid, bubonic plague, whatever was floating around, the soldiers spread it everywhere. Many more people died from disease than from actual combat. Some estimates suggest that 8 out of every 10 deaths were from plague, famine, and starvation, not from weapons. Reason 3. Economic collapse. Entire regions, particularly in Germany, went broke. Local economies couldn't function under constant occupation and reoccupation. There was no trade, no production, no stability. Money became worthless. Barter systems returned in some places because coins were non-existent. Noble families went bankrupt. The banking system, primitive as it was, collapsed. It took decades for some regions to recover economically. Reason 4. War crimes without consequences. Here's something disturbing. There were almost no rules. Soldiers on all sides committed atrocities with very few consequences. Massacres of civilians, destruction of property, burning of villages. It became normal, part of the landscape. One of the worst examples, the sack of Magdeburg in 1631. Swedish forces attacked the city, and the resulting massacre, combined with fires, killed by some estimates up to 20,000 people. The city never fully recovered. And this wasn't unusual, it was common. Reason 5. Diplomatic futility. Here's what's perhaps most absurd. None of this destruction accomplished all that much in the end. The Peace of Westphalia, the agreement that ended the war, didn't really redraw Europe's map dramatically. It confirmed the existing boundaries, gave some concessions to Sweden and France, and recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic. And that's about it. 8 to 12 million dead, hundreds of thousands of refugees, multiple generations traumatized, entire regions devastated, and the net result was minor territorial adjustments? That's perhaps the most devastating part, the sheer pointlessness of it all. Legacy. So what did the 30 Years' War leave behind? Well, let's look at some of the changes that actually happened. The religious wars end, for real this time. After 1648, religion stopped being the primary cause of major European wars, not because everyone suddenly got along, but because the principle of whoever rules decides the religion was eventually expanded to include the Calvinists. More importantly, people just got tired, and the wars became so destructive that nobody wanted to keep fighting over theology. From now on, major conflicts would be about power, not faith, which is arguably not much better, but at least it's more predictable. The nation-state takes shape. The Holy Roman Empire never really recovers its former prestige. The individual German states get stronger. Eventually, Germany emerges as a collection of independent kingdoms and principalities, much smaller than the centralized powers like France, Spain, and eventually Prussia. The concept of sovereignty, the idea that states are independent and shouldn't interfere in each other's internal affairs, starts to take root after Westphalia. This principle still guides international law today. Yes, the modern concept of national sovereignty partly comes from 1648. War becomes worse. Military technology advances. The tactics developed during this war, combined arms, professional standing armies, logistics, all become standard. War becomes more efficient at killing large numbers of people. Latter wars will borrow heavily from what was learned and unlearned during these 30 devastating years. And so we arrive at the end of this terrible journey. 1648. The survivors breathe a sigh of relief. The soldiers go home. The fields slowly begin to get planted again. 8 to 12 million dead. Millions more displaced. Cultures devastated. Economies shattered. And for what? For a religious conflict that had long stopped being about religion? For power? For pride? The 30 Years' War stands as a warning, a monument to how badly things can go wrong when ambition, ideology, and opportunity collide. It's a reminder that war rarely solves what it purports to fight for, and the costs fall heaviest on those least responsible for starting it. Next time you hear about a conflict that drags on indefinitely, remember, we've seen this before. Human beings have always found new and imaginative ways of destroying each other. But hopefully, we can learn from the past. Thanks for watching. I'm glad you made it through this journey with me. I know we barely scratched the surface of the full 30-year war. Leave a comment if you would like a follow-up video exploring this war further. If you want to learn more about the history that shaped our world, subscribe and hit that bell, and join me for the next deep dive. Until then, stay curious, and I'll see you next time. It's the year 1341. You're a peasant in medieval England, and you've just spotted a dust cloud on the horizon. Horses, lots of them, and they're coming straight towards your village. You have maybe 10 minutes to react. What do? Do you run? Hide in a barn? Pray? Or do you do what people actually did in this situation? Scream to the castle at the top of your lungs while everyone scrambles towards that giant stone fortress on the hill. Welcome to What Is, where we answer the questions you didn't know you needed answered. and today we're talking about one of the most iconic structures in human history, the castle. We're going to explore what castles actually were, why they looked the way they did, and how these massive stone buildings protected entire cities and kingdoms. By the end, you'll understand why medieval engineers were basically the cybersecurity experts of their day, except their firewalls were 20 feet thick and came with boiling oil. The basics. Let's start with a question that seems obvious but isn't. What exactly is a castle? Most people picture a fairy tale palace with flags waving and princesses waving from towers, but in medieval terms, a castle was fundamentally a military installation. It was a fortified residence, yes, but the fortified part was the entire point. Castles were built first and foremost for defense and projecting power. The word castle comes from the Latin castellum, which means fortified palace or fort. And here's where it gets interesting. Medieval castles weren't invented in medieval times. They evolved from earlier fortifications that date back thousands of years. The Romans had fortified structures. Ancient civilizations had walls around their cities. The basic concept of build a big wall so the bad people can't get in is probably as old as humanity itself. But the specific type of stone castle we typically imagine, the consecrated fortress with towers and battlements, really came into its own after the Norman conquest of England in 1066. William the Conqueror built dozens of them, and suddenly every lord in Europe wanted one. So why did castles become so important? Well, the Middle Ages were chaotic. We're talking about a period where there was no standing police force, no unified national army, and a king who might control the big cities but had limited power over the countryside. In this environment, if you were a noble and you wanted to protect your land, your family, and your wealth, you had two options. Build a really good fence, or get ready to lose everything. Castles were the ultimate insurance policy. A well-built castle could withstand a siege from an army that vastly outnumbered its defenders. It could serve as a headquarters for military operations. It could house the local population in times of danger. It was a permanent visual statement of power that said to everyone in the region, "This land belongs to me, and good luck trying to take it." Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to What Is and hit that notification bell. We release new videos every day exploring things you never knew you wanted to know about, like the origins of the saxophone, or the Great Wall of China isn't actually visible from space. Now back to castles. And trust me, the next part is where it gets really cool. Architecture of defense. Let's talk about castle architecture, because medieval engineers were absolutely brilliant at designing for defense. The basic medieval castle evolved through several stages. The earliest were moat and baileys, basically a wooden keep on a raised earth mound surrounded by a fenced enclosure. These were quick to build and reasonably effective, but they had a major weakness: wood burns. So around the 12th century, nobles started building everything out of stone. The stone keep became the central structure, a massive tower that was essentially a fortress unto itself. Walls were thick, often 8 to 15 feet thick. Windows were narrow slits, barely wide enough for an archer to shoot through, and everything was designed to make an attacker's life as miserable as possible. But the real masterpiece of a castle defense came with the concept of concentric fortification. This meant building multiple defensive walls, one inside the other, creating layers of protection. If enemies got past the outer wall, they still had to cross an open killing ground called the killing zone, then breach an inner wall, only to find that the castle was designed to trap them in corridors where defenders could attack from multiple directions. Next, let's take a look at the key defensive features. First is the curtain wall. That's the main defensive wall surrounding the entire castle. But it wasn't a straight wall. It had towers built at regular intervals, projecting outward so that defenders could shoot along the face of the wall, catching attackers in the sides. These towers were circular or polygonal, rather than square, because square corners are structurally weak points that attackers could undermine or collapse. Then there's the battlements, the iconic jagged top part of the wall that you see in every movie. Battlements had two parts, the solid part called the merlon, which protected the defender, and the open part called the crenel, where the defender stood to shoot. The alternating pattern allowed for defenders to stay mostly protected while still having lines of sight to shoot arrows, throw rocks, or pour anything unpleasant on the people below. And by anything unpleasant, I absolutely mean boiling oil, though historians debate how commonly this was actually used. What we know was used includes boiling water, quicklime which burns on contact, and heated sand, which gets into the armor and causes horrifying burns. Medieval warfare was creative in its cruelty. The gatehouse was the most heavily defended part of any castle. It wasn't just a door in the wall, it was a small fortress unto itself. Most gatehouses had a portcullis, that heavy metal grill that drops down in movies, plus a wooden door, and often a murder hole in the ceiling above the entrance. Attackers who made it through the door would find themselves in a narrow corridor, where defenders could pour things on them while being pelted from the sides by arrows shooting through the narrow openings called arrow slits. Some gatehouses had what was called a bent entrance, a design where the path through the gate turned sharply, forcing attackers to expose their right side while they navigated the turn. The right side was the unshielded side for most medieval soldiers. Everything was designed to maximize the advantage the defenders had. And we haven't even mentioned the moat. Many castles, especially later ones, were surrounded by a water-filled ditch that made it impossible to approach the walls with ladders or siege towers. Some moats were natural, but many were deliberately dug and maintained. They added an enormous amount of defensive depth. A moat could be 30 feet deep, 60 feet wide, making tunneling underneath extremely difficult and direct assault nearly impossible. Castles as a military strategy. Now here's something that might surprise you. Castles weren't just passive structures. They were active military installations that shaped how wars were fought across entire regions. Think of a castle as a secured checkpoint that controlled the surrounding territory. A network of castles could essentially divide a country into zones of control. If you controlled the castles, then you controlled the roads, the trade routes, and ultimately the people living in between them. This is why building castles was such an aggressive act. When William the Conqueror built castles across England after 1066, he wasn't just protecting himself, he was actively establishing Norman dominance over the Anglo-Saxon population. Every new castle was a statement. We're here, we're staying, resistance is pointless. In military terms, castles served several crucial functions. First, they were lookouts and communication centers. Castle towers were built high specifically so that signal fires could be seen from one castle to the next. A threat spotted at one end of a region could be communicated across the entire network within hours, allowing defenders to concentrate forces where they were needed. Second, they were supply caches. Castles stored food, weapons, and equipment, not just for their own garrison, but for the surrounding region. In times of invasion, villagers could retreat to the castle, knowing there would be enough food and water to withstand a prolonged siege. Third, and perhaps most importantly, castles disrupted enemy logistics. An invading army had to either capture a castle along its line of advance, or leave garrisons behind to blockade them. Either option slowed down the invasion dramatically, and diverted military resources. A single castle could tie up an entire army for months. This is why castle design evolved to make siege warfare as difficult and time-consuming as possible. The longer a castle held out, the more time the defender's allies had to gather forces and respond. A well-designed castle could survive months of siege, and during that time, the attacking army was spending enormous amounts of money and morale while stationary. Some of history's most famous military campaigns centered on castle siege warfare. The Crusades involved countless sieges of castle fortifications. The 100 Years' War between England and France was essentially a decades-long chess game of castle capture and defense. The Teutonic Knights of Eastern Europe built an entire network of brick castles as they expanded their territory. The effectiveness of castles eventually declined with the development of gunpowder artillery in the 15th century. Cannonballs could breach walls that had resisted arrows and ladders for centuries. During their prime, roughly from 1000 AD to 1500 AD, medieval castles were the ultimate defensive technology. Life inside the castle. So far we've talked about castles as military structures, but they were also homes, sometimes for hundreds of people during sieges, and for the noble family and their household on a daily basis. Life inside a medieval castle was both more comfortable and more chaotic than you might imagine. The Great Hall was the heart of the castle, a large room where the lord held court, entertained guests, and where the household took meals together. This was where business was conducted, disputes were settled, and celebrations happened. Think of it as a combination of meeting room, dining hall, and living room, all in one multi-purpose space. Below the Great Hall and the Lord's private apartments were the service areas, kitchens, storerooms, workshops, and quarters for the castle's permanent staff. Castles were largely self-sufficient communities, with their own bakeries, breweries, and often their own chapels and schools. The castle's permanent population during peacetime might number from 50 to 200 people, including the lord's family, household knights, servants, craftsmen, and religious staff. During a siege, this number could swell to include villagers and their livestock seeking refuge. And here's a detail that surprises people. Castles weren't always cold, damp, and miserable. Later medieval castles had increasingly sophisticated features, including glazed windows, private latrines, and even rudimentary heating systems. The lord's chambers could be quite comfortable, decorated with tapestries and furnished with carved wooden chairs and beds with actual mattresses. But make no mistake, a castle was still a fortress, and even the nicest apartments had arrow slits rather than large windows. The floors were stone, the walls were thick enough to block sunlight, and at any given moment, the peaceful daily routine could give way to the chaos of siege preparations, reinforcing gates, filling water barrels, and readying the defensive weaponry. This dual nature, simultaneously a comfortable home and a military installation, was fundamental to how medieval people understood castles. The same walls that kept out invaders also kept the family secure. The same tower that served as a lookout point was also the master's bedroom. Everything in the castle's design reflected this blend of domestic and defensive function. The castle's legacy. By the 16th century, the age of castles was effectively over. Artillery could breach the thickest of walls. The rise of professional armies meant that noble families no longer needed their own private fortifications for security. Many castles fell into disrepair, were converted into country houses, or were simply abandoned. But the castle's legacy lives on in fascinating ways. The word castle itself entered the English language with its military meaning, and we still use castle-related metaphors today. We castle in chests to protect our king. We describe people as building walls around their emotions, and the image of a noble castle on a hill remains one of the most powerful symbols of protection, heritage, and stability in Western culture. Modern military architecture still reflects principles developed in medieval castles. Military bases are designed with layered defenses, restricted access points, and observation towers. The concept of creating secure zones that control the surrounding territory. That's straight out of medieval military strategy. And of course, castles remain massive tourist attractions, drawing millions of visitors every year who want to walk the same corridors, climb the same towers, and imagine what life was like when these stone giants were active centers of medieval power. So there you have it. Castles weren't just fairy tale palaces. They were sophisticated military installations, symbols of political power, community shelters in times of danger, and homes all at the same time. The next time you see a castle on a hill or in a movie, you'll understand why it looks the way it does. Every tower, every wall, every narrow window was part of a deliberate design to protect people inside and make attackers' lives as difficult as possible. Medieval engineers were solving the same problem we solve today, with cybersecurity and secured facilities. How do you keep the wrong people out while letting the right people function? If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval fortifications, make sure to check out our other videos. Subscribe to What Is and hit the bell for notifications, because we have much more coming that will help you understand the world in ways you never expected. Because every answer leads to 3 more questions, and that's the best part of learning. Until next time, keep asking questions. See you in the next one. What if I told you there's a building so massive, so incredibly enormous, that astronauts can actually see it from space? Wait, hold on. Before you start nodding enthusiastically, put that knowledge on hold. Because as it turns out, that famous fact you learned in elementary school might not be entirely factual. Welcome to What Is, and today we're diving into one of the most iconic structures in human history. A monument so legendary, it inspired a certain salad dressing, countless action movies, and at least one very confusing DreamWorks animated film. We are talking about the Great Wall of China. But here's what most people don't know. The Great Wall isn't actually one wall. It wasn't built in a single lifetime. And no, you can't see it from space with the naked eye. Sorry, Neil Armstrong. So let's reset the narrative. Today we're going to uncover the real story behind the world's most famous barrier. We'll explore ancient China before the wall, discover why emperors became obsessed with building it, and learn how millions of workers literally moved mountains to make this happen, and separate the fascinating truth from the entertaining myths. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and let's get into it. 1. Origins: China before the building. To understand why anyone would think to build a wall stretching over 21,000 kilometers, we need to travel back in time, way back, to a period when China wasn't even yet China, at least as we know it today. It's around 221 BCE, and the land that would become China is fractured into 7 major warring states. Think Game of Thrones, but with more silk and fewer dragons. These states, the Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Chao, Wei, and Qin, are constantly at each other's throats, fighting over territory, resources, and generally just being excellent neighbors. The dominant military power among these states is Qin, and under the leadership of a remarkably ambitious king named Yin Zheng, Qin is about to do something unprecedented. Yin Zheng was by all accounts a complex guy. Historians call him a ruthless unifier who burned books, buried scholars alive, and enforced brutal laws. But he also accomplished something no one else had done before. He conquered all 7 warring states and unified them into a single empire in 221 BCE. This was huge. For the first time in Chinese history, the entire territory is under one ruler. Yin Zheng takes the title Qin Shi Huang, basically meaning the first emperor of Qin, and essentially invents the concept of imperial China. Now here's where things get interesting. Qin Shi Huang isn't just content with conquering territories, he's paranoid about losing them. You see, his newly unified empire sits right next to some very threatening neighbors to the north, particularly the nomadic Xiongnu, a confederation of warrior tribes who excel at mounted warfare and have a nasty habit of raiding Chinese settlements. While the Chinese perfected bureaucracy, advanced metallurgy, and developed breathtaking art, the Xiongnu perfected something equally as important: horse riding and archery from horseback. This made them incredibly difficult to fight using traditional Chinese military tactics, which favored infantry and chariots. The Xiongnu weren't just raiders either, they were a legitimate political and military power. At their height, they even forced the Chinese to pay tribute, essentially paying these nomads to please, for the love of all that's holy, stop attacking us. Qin Shi Huang had had enough, and so according to historical records, he ordered the construction of what would become the first iteration of the Great Wall, a series of fortifications connected to protect the empire's northern border. But here's the twist. The wall built under Qin Shi Huang wasn't the wall you see in photos today. It was crude, built primarily from compacted earth and straw, and looked dramatically different from the majestic stone structure that would come later. And interestingly, it wasn't actually called the Great Wall by the Qin. That name came much later. The earliest segments were known as various names: the walls, the boundaries, the ramparts. The first emperor essentially said, "We need a really big fence," and thus a legend was born, though it would take more than 2,000 years to reach its modern form. But the Qin dynasty didn't last long. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, and his empire collapsed shortly after, giving way to the Han dynasty, which would take over the wall project and expand it significantly. 2. Purpose. Why was it built? Now you might be thinking, okay, some paranoid emperor built a big wall to keep out the bad guys. Pretty straightforward, right? Oh my friends, if only it was that simple. The main purpose of the Great Wall evolved over time, and understanding these shifting motivations reveals fascinating insights about Chinese history, geopolitics, and human stubbornness. Let's break it down. Purpose number 1. Military defense. This is the obvious one, and where we should start. The Great Wall served as a defensive barrier against northern invaders, primarily the Xiongnu, and later various nomadic groups like the Mongols and the Manchus. But here's what the movies don't show you. The wall wasn't actually designed to be a fortress that enemies could never breach. Military strategy was way more nuanced than that. The wall served several defensive functions. First, it acted as a surveillance platform. Watchtowers, often built at regular intervals along the wall, allowed soldiers to spot approaching enemies from vast distances. Smoke signals and fire beacons could communicate warning messages across hundreds of kilometers, faster than any messenger could ride. Second, it created a physical barrier that slowed down invading armies. Horses and carts couldn't just gallop over 20 feet of stone wall. This forced enemies to either breach the wall at specific points, which the Chinese could then defend heavily, or find alternative routes through the mountains and the deserts, which were often worse logistic nightmares than attacking the wall directly. Third, the wall served as a transportation artery for rapid troop deployment. Soldiers could move along the wall quickly, responding to attacks in one region by rushing reinforcements from another. This created a strategic depth that made the border much harder to penetrate. Purpose number 2. Economic control. This is where things get interesting. The wall wasn't just a military infrastructure, it was also an economic tool. Trade routes, specifically the famous Silk Road, ran along China's northern borders. The wall helped regulate trade, where goods entered and exited the empire, and more importantly, who got to profit from it. The Chinese developed a sophisticated system of border gates or passes where merchants could legally enter or leave the empire. These passes became important economic hubs where taxes were collected, goods were inspected, and trade was facilitated, all under imperial supervision, of course. The wall essentially said, you can trade with us, but you do it our way, through our doors, and we take our cut. Purpose 3. Immigration control, ancient style. Long before debates about border walls became modern political footballs, the Chinese were grappling with similar questions. How do we regulate who enters our territory? The Great Wall helped control population movement. It created a clear delineation between inside and outside, between the civilized empire and the wild territories beyond. This wasn't just about keeping enemies out, it was about maintaining a clear cultural and political boundary. Purpose number 4. Prestige and power. Here's a truth that doesn't get discussed enough. The Great Wall was also a massive psychological and political symbol. Emperors who built or extended the wall weren't just defending territory. They were demonstrating their power, their legitimacy, and their dedication to protecting the Chinese people. Building the wall was a way of saying to future generations, I was a great emperor, look what I accomplished. The massive undertaking signaled to other states and potential enemies, this empire has the resources, organization, and determination to construct something incomprehensible. Do not test us. In a way, the wall was ancient China's most dramatic TED talk. Here's proof of our superiority, now what you gonna do about it? Purpose number 5. Securing the Silk Road. As trade routes expanded, protecting them became economically vital. The wall helped secure the Silk Road's corridors, ensuring that merchants and the valuable goods and taxes they generated could move more safely. The irony? Some of the most famous sections of the wall were actually built not to keep foreigners out, but to protect Chinese merchants going out to trade. So to summarize why the Great Wall was built, basically ancient Chinese emperors looked at the northern border and said, We need protection from horseback archers. We need to control trade, and we need to project power, and honestly, we just need something impressive to put on the travel brochure. And thus, the largest construction project in human history began. 3. How is it built? How do you build a wall across thousands of kilometers of vastly different terrain, mountains, desert, grassland, and river valleys? The answer is very, very slowly, and with an absolutely staggering amount of human effort. Let's talk about the construction of the Great Wall, because the engineering challenges involved are mind-boggling when you consider that this was built without modern machinery, cranes, or diesel trucks. The materials. What the wall was made of depended heavily on what was locally available. In the mountains where stone was abundant, the wall was built from stone blocks. This is the iconic image we see in photos today. Some sections featured huge granite blocks cut with remarkable precision. In the plains and deserts, where stone was scarce, builders used rammed earth techniques. This sounds simple, but it was actually sophisticated engineering. Workers would compact layers of earth, sand, and gravel into wooden forms, layer after layer, creating walls that could be 20 feet thick at the base. Fun fact, rammed earth is so effective that some sections of the ancient wall, built over 2,000 years ago, still stand today. The materials science was no joke. For certain sections, builders used materials like bricks, wood, and even reeds in sandy areas. The labor. Now here's where history gets uncomfortable, and we need to be honest about this. The Great Wall was built almost entirely by hand, and by hand we mean by millions of laborers over centuries. These include soldiers. Military personnel were often assigned to construction duties as part of their service. Peasants. During off-seasons when farming wasn't possible, peasants were conscripted for construction. This was sometimes voluntary, often not. Prisoners. Captured enemies and criminals were sent to work on the wall, essentially forced labor. Recruited workers. In later dynasties, some workers were actually paid for their labor, though the conditions were still brutal. The stories of suffering and death are documented in historical records and Chinese folklore. Workers died from accidents, exhaustion, disease, and exposure to the harsh elements. It's believed that the number of workers who died during the construction numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates suggest millions. The saying, "every brick has a worker's life behind it." Whether this is true, it's impossible to verify, but it reflects a cultural memory of the immense sacrifice involved. There's a darker legend that the wall contains the bodies of workers within its structure, essentially human cement. While this appears to be more myth than fact, archaeological evidence doesn't support widespread human remains in the wall. It speaks to the collective memory of suffering. The engineering. Let's appreciate the technical achievements here. Surveying. Building a wall across mountains requires incredible surveying precision. Workers had to navigate complex terrain while maintaining consistent route. They used astronomical observations, geometry, and simple tools to create straight lines through vast distances. The wall design. The wall wasn't a solid barrier. It was a sophisticated military system consisting of the main wall itself, sometimes with a raised walkway for soldiers. Battlements. Those signature notched tops that allow soldiers to defend while remaining partially protected. Watchtowers at regular intervals, some as close as every 500 meters, in high-risk areas. Signal towers for communication, barracks and stables for soldiers, gates, passes at strategic locations. Supporting walls in some areas to create multiple lines of defense. Logistics. Imagine coordinating construction across thousands of kilometers with pre-modern transportation. Materials had to be transported by hand, animal, and simple cart. Food, water, and tools had to be delivered to remote construction sites. Some sections required building entirely new roads just to get construction materials to the site. Who built which sections? The wall we see today, actually represents construction under multiple dynasties. The Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE, built the first major walls, primarily from earth and wood. The Han dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, extended the walls significantly, adding many stone sections. The Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, built the most recognizable sections, the ones most tourists photograph today. Ming construction emphasized stone and brick, using sophisticated techniques that created the beautiful, durable walls we associate with the site. Ming engineers also added sophisticated features, like dedicated drainage systems, secret internal communication passages, and crenellations designed specifically for defensive gunpowder warfare. The entire construction process spanned over 2 millennia, with different emperors adding, repairing, and rebuilding sections continuously. To put this in perspective, if you started building when the pyramids were constructed and continued without stopping, you'd be working on the wall when Columbus set sail to America. That's a lot of overtime. Alright, we're about halfway through, and if you're finding this fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're just getting started. There's so much more to uncover, including some truly absurd myths about the wall that I'm excited to debunk. But for now, let's keep going because we haven't even got to the best part yet. 4. Uses since it was built. So the wall got built. Now what? The interesting thing about the Great Wall is that its purpose and uses evolved dramatically over time, even as construction continued. Let's explore how this magnificent structure has been utilized throughout history. Military use, the primary function. For most of its existence, the wall served, surprise, military purposes. During various periods of Chinese history, the wall was actively garrisoned with troops. At its peak, estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of soldiers were stationed along the wall's length. These weren't just guards, they were full military garrisons, with permanent barracks for housing soldiers year-round, storage facilities for food, weapons and supplies, stables for horses, farmland within the wall system to grow food, signal fire systems for rapid communication. The wall essentially created a protected military zone in China's north, a forward defense line that made attacking the heartland significantly more difficult. During times of peace, the wall served as a border patrol mechanism, monitoring who entered and exited the empire. During times of war, when the threat of invasion was real, troops would mass at strategic points and the wall became a defensive backbone for military operations. The Silk Road and trade. As mentioned earlier, the wall played a crucial role in facilitating trade along the Silk Road. The strategic passes, gates in the wall where travelers could legally enter or exit, became important trade hubs. Famous passes like Jiaigugan in the west and Shanhaigan in the east developed into thriving commercial centers. These weren't just customs offices, they were essentially ancient free trade zones where merchants could rest, trade, pay taxes, and resupply before continuing their journeys. The wall helped to regulate this trade, preventing illegal smuggling while facilitating legitimate commerce. It was in essence ancient China's way of saying, we welcome your business, but you go through the proper channels. Cultural and symbolic functions. Over time, the wall transcended its military and economic purposes to become a powerful cultural symbol. Imperial legitimacy. Emperors who maintained and extended the wall demonstrated their devotion to protecting China. It became a measure of imperial success. Literary inspiration. Poets and writers throughout Chinese history have referenced the wall as a symbol of perseverance, human achievement, and the relationship between humanity and nature. Consider this line from a famous Chinese poem. Who will be the loyal minister, the good general? Who will scale the great wall? The wall became shorthand for sacrifice, duty, and protective power. Barrier between civilizations. The wall became a symbol of the boundary between civilized Chinese world and the barbarian territories beyond, not necessarily in an offensive way, but as a definition of cultural space. Tourism and pilgrimage. Believe it or not, the wall became a tourist attraction even in ancient times. Wealthy Chinese visitors traveled to view the wall, writing poetry about their experiences and appreciating the engineering achievement. It was considered a worthy journey, the ancient equivalent to posting on Instagram at a world wonder. In more recent centuries, the wall has become one of the most visited tourist sites in China, with sections like Badaling near Beijing receiving millions of visitors annually. Agricultural use. In some areas, the wall served agricultural purposes. The garrisons farmed land with the defensive system's protection, creating agricultural production that supplemented military supplies. Modern uses. Today, the wall serves entirely new purposes. Tourism, obviously. It generates significant revenue and is a source of national pride. Educational value. It's a living classroom for engineering, history, and archaeology. Cultural symbol. It represents Chinese civilization's endurance and achievement. Environmental protection. Some sections now fall within protected nature areas, preserving ecological habitat. Running events. Yes, people actually run along the wall for sport. There's a famous marathon called the Great Wall Marathon, where competitors run up and down the wall's steep steps. Remember, I ran the Great Wall is a flex, it's not a vacation recommendation. So there you have it, a defensive system, trade barrier, poetry inspiration, and extreme sports venue. The Great Wall, doing things other walls can only dream of. 5. Misconceptions and untruths. Now this is the fun part. The Great Wall is shrouded in so many myths and misconceptions and flat out false facts that we've collectively created a version of the wall that exists more in imagination than in reality. So let's clear some of these up, shall we? Misconception number 1. You can see the Great Wall from space. This is perhaps one of the most persistent facts about the wall, and it's completely false. Let me be clear. No, you cannot see the Great Wall from the moon. No, you cannot see it from space with the naked eye, contrary to some claims. No, not even from low Earth orbit is it easily visible. In 2003, Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei confirmed that after a spaceflight that he could not see the wall. NASA has stated repeatedly that the wall is not visible to the unaided eye from space. Why not? There's several reasons. The wall is only about 6 to 10 meters wide. It's much more narrow than people assume. The materials used blend with the surrounding terrain in color. And from space, many human structures are barely visible, and the wall is just not distinctive enough. Here's a fun test. Next time you're on an airplane at normal cruising altitude, around 10,000 meters, try and spot the wall. You'll be amazed how difficult it is. The myth likely originated from a 1754 book by William Stuckley that suggested hypothetically such a structure might be visible from the moon. This got repeated, exaggerated, and eventually became common knowledge. The reality is, if you can see the Great Wall from space, you probably have superpowers, and that you should probably be using them for something more exciting than fact-checking architecture. Misconception number 2. The Great Wall is one continuous structure. I touched on this earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. There isn't one Great Wall. What we now call the Great Wall of China is actually a network of walls, built and renovated over centuries by different dynasties. These segments aren't even all connected. The total length is often cited as over 21,000 kilometers. I even said that at the start of this video, and it's more than half the Earth's circumference. But this includes many disconnected sections, walls built by different states, and various defensive structures. If you drove along every piece of wall material ever built, you could theoretically circle the Earth more than twice, but you couldn't walk a single uninterrupted path from one end to the other. Misconception number 3. It was built by soldiers, not slaves. The honest truth is more complicated. While some laborers were soldiers assigned to construction duty, and later dynasties sometimes used paid laborers, the early construction phases, particularly under the Qin dynasty, involved significant forced labor, including prisoners and conscripted peasants. The wall's construction is deeply entangled with stories of suffering and exploitation. Pretending otherwise isn't helpful. Later periods saw more varied labor practices, including the use of professional construction workers paid for their labor, especially during the Ming Dynasty. The takeaway? The wall was built by people, with all the complexity that entails. Misconception number 4. It was built to keep out invading armies in general. Not quite. While military defense was a primary purpose, the wall was specifically designed to defend against mounted nomadic warriors, the Xiongnu, Mongols, and Manchus. Different threats require different responses, and the wall was optimized for dealing with fast-moving cavalry that couldn't be effectively countered by traditional Chinese infantry. The Chinese didn't build walls against other settled civilizations to the south or east. There was no need. The wall was a response to a very specific military challenge. How do you defend a massive border against highly mobile enemies? Misconception number 5. It's the only Great Wall. China isn't the only civilization that built massive walls. The Romans built walls, Hadrian's Wall, and the Limes Germanicus. The Persians built walls, the Koreans built walls. There's even evidence of ancient walls in other regions. What makes the Chinese wall great is its sheer scale. It's the largest wall system ever built. And the concept of fortifying borders with walls? That's almost universal in human history. Misconception number 6. It was never effective. Here's a nuanced truth. The wall was neither impenetrable or useless. Critics point out that invading armies sometimes breached or went round the wall. The Mongols, for instance, ultimately conquered China, despite the wall existing in various forms. But military effectiveness isn't binary. The wall made invasion harder. It slowed armies, forced them into predictable routes, allowed early warning, and provided defensive advantages. It didn't prevent all invasions, but it made them more costly and difficult. For an empire facing constant pressure from nomadic raiders, that was incredibly valuable. Think of it like a home security system. A determined professional can probably get past your alarm system eventually, but does that mean you shouldn't have one? The wall raised the cost of attack, and that is strategically significant. Misconception number 7. It was built by a single visionary emperor. In popular culture, we like to attribute the wall to one great ruler. Usually Qin Shi Huang, or perhaps a Ming emperor. The reality, the wall was built incrementally over centuries, with dozens of emperors and dynasties contributing. There's no single architect or builder. It's a collective project of an entire civilization across 2 millennia. So next time someone confidently tells you that they saw the Great Wall from space, you have my permission to politely inform them that they've been bamboozled, and that their astronaut application might need some work. 6. Modern meaning. What does the Great Wall mean in the 21st century? This question is worth exploring because the wall has transformed from a military structure into something far more complex, a symbol that means different things to different people. To the Chinese people, the wall holds immense significance as a symbol of Chinese civilization's endurance and achievement. In many ways, it has become an expression of national identity, a physical manifestation of the idea that China has endured for thousands of years, surviving invasions, dynasties, revolutions, and modernization. There's a Chinese saying, "Those who haven't reached a Great Wall aren't true men." The wall represents achievement, perseverance, and reaching for something greater. President Richard Nixon reportedly said after visiting the wall in 1972, "We have been here before. It's great. It makes one feel humble. It makes one think about the course of history." That sense of humility and historical perspective remains central to the wall's meaning. To historians and archaeologists, for scholars, the wall is an invaluable primary source, a physical record of engineering techniques, military strategy, trade routes, and cultural interactions across centuries. Ongoing archaeological work continues to reveal new information about construction techniques, the lives of soldiers stationed there, and the evolution of the wall systems over time. Some sections remain unexcavated, holding secrets we haven't yet discovered. To tourists, for the millions who visit annually, the wall represents adventure, history, and a tangible connection to the ancient world. There's something profound about walking where soldiers walked, seeing the same mountains and valleys that emperors surveyed, and touching stones placed by hands 2,000 years ago. It has become a bucket list destination, the kind of place that feels significant to visit, regardless of your interest in history. The symbol in modern culture. The wall has become a pop culture touchstone, appearing in films, video games, books, and advertising. DreamWorks made an animated film about it. It's been referenced in countless action movies. It appeared in video games from Civilization to Age of Empires. Its imagery we instantly recognize. This pop culture presence has both benefits, increasing awareness, and drawbacks, perpetuating misconceptions. Contested meanings. Here's where things get politically complex. The wall has been invoked in modern political debates about borders, immigration, and national identity, on all sides. Some see it as an inspiration, a historical precedent for protecting national sovereignty. Others see it as a cautionary tale about the futility of walls against human movement. These modern interpretations are contested and reflect contemporary political divisions more than historical reality. The ancient Chinese built the wall for specific reasons, having to do with nomadic warfare, not modern immigration debates. Preservation versus exploitation. A modern challenge is balancing preservation with access. Some sections of the wall have been restored to attract tourists. Others remain ruined in their ancient state. There's an ongoing debate about how much restoration is appropriate, how to prevent erosion and damage from visitors, and how to fund maintenance. The wall is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, granting it international protection, but that protection requires resources, management, and difficult decision about preservation priorities. The wall today. Today, the Great Wall stands as a monument to human ambition, engineering capability, and the desire to protect what we've built. It reminds us that people have always grappled with questions of borders, defense, and interaction with the others. And those questions haven't gotten any easier. In a world of satellites, drones, and digital warfare, there's something almost quaint about the wall. But the underlying human impulse, that desire to protect what's ours, to define boundaries, to create lasting monuments, that hasn't changed. The Great Wall has become a mirror reflecting our own questions about civilization, progress, and what we leave behind. And there we have it, the real story behind one of humanity's most impressive achievements. We started with a fractured China, unification under an ambitious emperor, and a need to defend against mounted warriors. We followed a construction project spanning over 2,000 years, built by millions of hands using tools that seem impossibly primitive. We debunked myths about space visibility, continuous structure, and single-handed construction. And we arrived at a modern symbol that means everything from national pride to tourist selfie opportunities. The Great Wall remains, not as simply a story, but as a complex testament to human civilization's ambitions, capabilities, and contradictions. It's a wall that became a wonder, a defense that became a symbol, an ancient project that still captures our imagination today. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of history's most fascinating structures. If you learned something new today, hit that like button. If you want more historical deep dives, subscribe and join our community. And remember, in the words of ancient Chinese wisdom, those who haven't reached the Great Wall aren't true men. Now get out there, explore the world, physically, historically, digitally, whatever it takes to satisfy that curiosity. I'll see you in the next one. It's 1953. You've just finished fighting in what historians will later call one of the most brutal conflicts in modern history. You've watched your friends die on frozen mountain ridges. You've marched through mud that wanted to swallow you whole. You've done things you'd rather not remember. And now, finally, the guns are silent. The fighting has stopped. So you pack up your things. You shake hands with the enemy you've been trying to kill for 3 years. You go home. And then, nothing happens. No celebration. No victory parade. No formal end. No peace treaty. Your country is still technically at war, and it will be for the next 70+ years. And you'll pass that war down to your grandchildren. And their grandchildren. That's not a movie plot. That's not some dystopian novel. That is literally happening right now, on this very day, on a peninsula in East Asia. This is the Korean War. And technically, it never ended. Welcome to What Is. Today we're going to unpack one of the most misunderstood conflicts in modern history, a war that shaped the geopolitical landscape of the entire 20th century and continues to define international relations today. A war that most Americans can't actually tell you much about, despite it being the site of some of the most ferocious fighting the world has ever seen. We're going to answer the question, what exactly was the Korean War? And why is it still technically ongoing today? Grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's do this. Context and background. To understand the Korean War, we need to go back further than 1950. We need to understand how Korea went from one country to two countries. And that story starts with heartbreak, colonization, and a world war that changed everything. For over 35 years, from 1910 to 1945, Korea was under Japanese rule. The Japanese colonizers, let's call them what they were not gentle rulers. They suppressed Korean language, Korean culture, Korean identity. They forced people to adopt Japanese names. They took land from farmers. They worked people in factories and mines under brutal conditions. They committed atrocities that, frankly, the world didn't pay enough attention to at the time. Korea was a colony. Its people were subjects. And they hated it. Every Korean you meet whose family lived through that period carries that trauma. It's not ancient history. There are still people alive today who remember the Japanese flag flying over Seoul, who remember being told they were not Korean, but subjects of the emperor. That matters. That context matters. Then came World War II. In 1945, the Japanese Empire collapsed. The atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the desperate final battles, it all came crashing down in August of 1945. And suddenly, Korea was free. Or was it? Here's where things get complicated. When Japan surrendered, the Korean peninsula was divided. Not by Korea, by the Allies. You see, the US and the Soviet Union had agreed, in the closing days of the war, to accept the Japanese surrender north and south of the 38th parallel. The Americans would take the south, the Soviets would take the north. The 38th parallel, an imaginary line drawn on a map by two American military officers with a ruler and a map, became the border that would split a nation in two. Think about that for a second. A line drawn with a ruler. No consideration of geography, of families, of ethnicity, of culture. Just a line. A line that would split a people who had shared a language, a history, and an identity for over 1,000 years. And here's where I have to be careful, because if there's one thing that gets historians riled up, it's when you oversimplify the Cold War. But here's the basic truth. The US and the Soviet Union, those two massive superpowers, had very different visions for what Korea should become. The US wanted a free, democratic South Korea, a buffer against communism spreading in Asia. The Soviets wanted a communist North Korea, a Soviet ally, a buffer against American influence. And so, over the next few years, two governments formed. In the South, the US helped establish the Republic of Korea, with Syngman Rhee as its first president. In the North, the Soviets helped establish the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as its first premier. One country, two governments, two ideologically opposed superpowers backing each side. And everyone knew this couldn't last forever. The outbreak of war, June 25th, 1950. Most Americans had never heard of Korea. It wasn't in the news. It wasn't a priority. The war in Europe was 5 years over. The war in Japan was over. People wanted to move on, to enjoy peace, to forget about the last 15 years of global chaos. North Korea had crossed the border. 6 divisions, around 90,000 troops, moved south in a massive coordinated assault. They had Soviet tanks. They had Soviet advisors. They had the element of surprise. And they were coming fast. The South Korean army, undermanned, under-equipped, still rebuilding from colonial days, was overrun almost immediately. Towns fell, then cities, then the capital, Seoul, fell less than 3 days after the invasion. The world watched in shock. The US, which had essentially created South Korea and promised to protect it, had been caught completely off guard. President Truman, in the White House, made one of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century. The US would intervene. This was not just about Korea. This was about containing communism. This was about showing the world that the US would stand up to Soviet expansion. This was about the domino theory before it even had a name. And here's a fun fact. Well, fun might be the wrong word. But here's something that surprises most people. The US almost didn't send ground troops to Korea. The Joint Chiefs of Staff actually recommended using only air and naval power. It was the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who convinced Truman that air and naval power alone wouldn't be enough. Ground troops were necessary. So think about that. The next time you see those grainy black and white footage of US Marines storming up those hills, that almost didn't happen. The entire course of the war, the hundreds of thousands of deaths, almost played out completely differently. The UN Security Council, with the Soviet Union boycotting at the time over a different issue, a story for another video, passed a resolution calling for member nations to help South Korea. 16 countries would eventually send troops, but it was the US that carried the bulk of the fighting. And what fighting it was. If you're enjoying this dive into the Korean War, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And my ego too. Let's get back to the war. The war, inside major events. The Korean War was not what anyone expected. It wasn't the neat, clean, conventional war that military planners had imagined. It was brutal, chaotic, and at times completely insane. Let me give you the quick tour of the major phases. Phase 1, the retreat and the Pusan perimeter. In those first months, the North Koreans pushed all the way down to the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula. The UN forces, primarily American, were pushed into a tiny corner around the port city of Pusan. It looked, honestly, like they might be pushed into the sea. The North Koreans had the momentum. They had the numbers, they had the tanks. But then came the amphibious landing at Incheon. Incheon, September 15, 1950. General Douglas MacArthur, in one of the most daring military maneuvers in history, landed troops behind enemy lines, miles from the main fighting, in a port city with some of the most difficult tidal conditions in the world. The tides there vary by 30 feet. The beaches are mudflats. The intelligence people said it couldn't be done. MacArthur did it anyway, and it worked brilliantly. The North Korean forces, stretched thin and overextended, collapsed. The UN forces broke out of Pusan, recaptured Seoul, and pushed north, all the way north, past the 38th parallel, toward the Yalu River. The Yalu River, the border between Korea and China. And that's when things went sideways. Phase 2, Chinese intervention. China, freshly victorious in its own civil war, was not about to let American troops on its border. Mao Zedong, whose forces had just completed their own long march to power, saw the UN forces approaching and decided, enough. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteer troops crossed the Yalu River and hit the UN forces like a freight train. The 1st Marine Division, the US Army's 1st Cavalry Division, The British troops, the Turkish brigade, everyone got hit. The UN forces were pushed back. Seoul changed hands again. The war entered a new nightmare phase. And here's something that always blows people's minds. The Chinese troops didn't have the kind of equipment you'd expect. They were vastly outgunned in terms of firepower. What they had was numbers and sacrifice. They would march at night without lights, without sound, in complete silence, and then attack at dawn. The first the UN forces knew they were there was when the bullets started flying. There are veterans of the Korean War who still talk about the sound, the bugles, the horns, the shouting, charging across open ground into machine gun fire. It was wave after wave after wave. It was horrifying. It was effective. Phase 3. The stalemate. By 1951, the war had settled into a brutal, grinding stalemate. Both sides dug in along a line that would become famous, the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ. Both sides had powerful air support. Both sides had massive artillery. Both sides had learned, the hard way, that neither was going to win a total victory. The war became a war of attrition. It became a war of outposts and hills. It became a war of patrols and night raids. It became a war where men froze to death on mountain peaks and drowned in rice paddies and got blown apart by artillery fire that came from nowhere. And it went on, and on, and on. The armistice. Why the war never ended. July 27th, 1953. That's the date that matters. That's the date the fighting stopped. After 2 years of negotiations, yes, 2 years, while the fighting continued, the two sides signed an armistice agreement. Not a peace treaty, an armistice. What's the difference? Great question. A peace treaty formally ends a war. It declares victory and defeat or mutual understanding. It establishes permanent peace. An armistice is a ceasefire. It's an agreement to stop fighting, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the underlying conflict. And that is the key to understanding why the Korean War is technically still ongoing. When the armistice was signed in 1953, it created a demilitarized zone, a narrow strip of land, about 2.5 miles wide, running across the Korean peninsula, roughly along the 38th parallel. It established a ceasefire. It created mechanisms for monitoring the ceasefire. It allowed for the exchange of prisoners. But it did not, I cannot stress this enough, it did not create a peace treaty. Both Koreas, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, were created as separate entities. Neither ever recognized the other as legitimate. Neither ever signed a document saying, okay, we're one country now, or okay, we're two countries, and we're fine with that. The armistice was an agreement between the UN forces, the North Koreans, and the Chinese, but it was not a treaty between two sovereign nations. And here's the kicker. North Korea never signed the armistice. Let me explain. The armistice was signed by General William Harrison Jr. for the UN command, by General Nam Il for the Korean People's Army, and by General Peng Dehuai for the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. But the actual document was not signed by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That was a legal technicality that in some ways remains a point of contention to this day. So technically, from a legal standpoint, the North Korean government never technically agreed to stop fighting, which is one way to look at it, I guess. The result? For 71 years, the two Koreas have been in a state of neither war nor peace. There's a ceasefire, but not a peace. There's a border, but not a recognized international boundary. There's tension, but not active combat. And that matters. It matters enormously, because it means the Korean War was never really resolved. It was paused, and that pause has lasted longer than most of the people watching this video have been alive. The current situation. So what does this mean today? What does technically still ongoing actually look like on the ground? Here's what it looks like. The DMZ is one of the most heavily militarized borders on Earth. There are over 1 million troops stationed between the two Koreas. There are minefields, razor wire, watch tanks, artillery positions, and patrol routes. There are tunnels, multiple tunnels dug by North Korea into the south, discovered over the years, that were clearly intended for invasion. There are defection attempts, people fleeing North Korea, risking everything to cross the DMZ or the northern border into China. There are family separations, families split between North and South who haven't seen each other in 70 years. There are provocations, North Korean nuclear tests, missile launches, military drills that simulate attacks on the South. There are responses, joint military exercises between the US and South Korea, enhanced missile defense systems, economic sanctions. And there are the summits, the historic meetings between leaders, the handshake across the border, the hopeful moments of diplomacy that always seem to hit a wall. Here's a strange detail that puts things in perspective. There are still US troops in South Korea. Not a few, about 28,500 US military personnel are stationed there, permanently. Their grandchildren are now serving in the same places their grandparents served. There are service members who are third-generation Korean War veterans. Their grandfather served in the war, their father was stationed in Korea during the Cold War, and now they're there today. That's not a historical footnote, that's ongoing history. The Korean War never officially ended because a peace treaty was never signed. The underlying issues were never resolved. The division was never healed. And today, as we speak, North Korea is a nuclear power. And that changes everything about how this still ongoing conflict could potentially play out. This is not just history. This is the present. This is the future. Okay, I know this is heavy stuff. War, division, nuclear tensions. It's a lot to take in. But before we wrap up, I want to take a quick break and remind you why this matters. Why you're watching this video. Why you're learning about a war that ended 70 years ago, but never officially ended. This matters because it shapes the world you live in. The Korean War is the reason the US has military bases scattered across Asia. It's the reason South Korea and the US are such close allies. It's the reason Japan rearmed and became a military power, something that country hadn't done since World War II. It's the reason the Cold War got so hot in Asia. It's the reason your tax dollars go to defense spending in ways you might not realize. It's also the reason we have the tension we have today, with North Korea threatening tests, with Kim Jong-un making announcements, with the world watching nervously. So if you've learned something, if this has been valuable, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't. Join the What Is community. And stick around, because we're about to wrap up with why this all matters, and a special bonus fact at the end. Let's go. Why it matters today. The Korean War matters because it's not over. That's the simplest way to say it. That's the most important thing to understand. This is not a history lesson about something that happened and ended. This is a live situation, an ongoing conflict that has been frozen in time for 71 years, but could unfreeze at any moment. Think about that. The last time someone fired a shot in anger along the DMZ, Barack Obama was in middle school. The last time a soldier died in combat, Ronald Reagan was president. That's how long this ceasefire has held. But it's not permanent. It was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a pause, a breather, a chance to negotiate a peace. And those negotiations never happened. So why should you care? Why should you, watching this in whatever year you come across this video, care about a war that most history classes rush through in about 15 minutes? Because the Korean War is a window into how fragile peace really is. Because it shows how easily a line on a map can become a wall that lasts forever. Because it demonstrates how quickly the world can change, from peace to chaos to stalemate to a kind of frozen conflict that no one knows how to end. Because your life, your economic life, your security, your world, is shaped by decisions made in 1950, 1951, 1952, and 1953, by people you've never heard of, in places you've never been to, in a war that most people have forgotten. The Korean War matters because we are living in its aftermath. We have always been living in its aftermath. And unless something changes, unless a peace treaty is signed, unless the two Koreas find a way to coexist, unless the world finds a way to resolve the underlying tensions, we will continue to live in its aftermath. That's why you should care. That's why this matters. That's why we're talking about it today. And that's the Korean War. What it was, why it happened, and why it's still technically ongoing. If you found this video valuable, if you learned something, if this changed how you think about the world, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. What did you find most surprising? What do you want to learn more about? What other conflicts or historical events should we cover? Subscribe to What Is if you haven't already. Hit the bell to get notified when we post new videos. And if you want more content like this, more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world, we're just getting started. Before we go, here's that bonus fact I promised. Bonus fact. Here's a fact about the Korean War that even most history buffs don't know. There was a point during the war where the US seriously considered using nuclear weapons, not once, but multiple times. In 1953, as the war was grinding to a halt, President Eisenhower, who had himself been a general in World War II, considered using atomic weapons to break the stalemate. The idea was floated at high-level meetings. The Joint Chiefs of Staff actually discussed targeting North Korean cities with nuclear weapons. In the end, it was decided not to use them, partly because of the Chinese threat, partly because of Soviet nuclear capabilities, partly because of international backlash. But the fact that it was considered, that nuclear weapons were on the table in a war that killed millions, is a reminder of how close the world came to something even more catastrophic. And that is something to think about the next time you hear about tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. You're a Portuguese sailor in the year 1492. You've just spent 3 months on a wooden ship smaller than a modern city bus, surviving on hardtack that could double as ship ballast, and water that's developed a suspicious film on top. Your navigator thinks the world is round, which, kudos to him, is actually correct. But he also thinks he's 40 days away from Japan, when he's actually about to stumble into an entirely new continent. Now here's the real question. Why would anyone voluntarily sign up for this? Welcome to the age of exploration, the period when Europeans decided that sailing into the middle of nowhere on what was essentially a floating coffin was somehow a fantastic career choice. It's a story of greed, glory, God, and an absolutely staggering amount of geographical misunderstanding. Today we're answering the question, what is the age of exploration, and why did humanity decide this was a good idea? What is the age of exploration? I know some of you are already typing, wait, wasn't Columbus looking for India? In the comments, we'll get there. Patience is a virtue, and frankly, you'll need it. The age of exploration, sometimes called the age of discovery, generally refers to the period from roughly the early 15th century to the mid-17th century, when European powers embarked on systematic voyages of discovery, conquest, and colonization across the globe. It fundamentally reshaped the world in ways we're still dealing with today. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't some grand, coordinated effort. There was no European Union meeting where everyone agreed, all right, let's all discover new continents together. Instead, you had several different countries, each with their own motivations, racing to find new trade routes, new resources, and new territory. It was less a carefully planned expedition, and more like the world's most high-stakes game of financial Calvin ball. The traditional starting point is often cited as 1415, when the Portuguese captured Ceuta in North Africa. A small step for Portuguese imperialism, a giant leap for, maybe we can sail around this continent somehow. The ending is a bit more debatable. Some historians point to 1648 and the Peace of Westphalia, which recognized the sovereignty of many new nations and effectively ended the old colonial order. Others say it wound down gradually throughout the 17th century, as exploration gave way to outright colonization and the establishment of permanent overseas empires. But here's the real question. Why did this happen when it did? Why weren't the Chinese or the Arabs or the Romans doing this centuries earlier? I mean, the Romans had ships. The Chinese had the largest naval fleet in the world in the early 1400s. What made Europeans suddenly say, you know what, let's find out what's behind that big ocean? The answer, as always with history, is complicated, and honestly, a little bit ridiculous. Origins. Why did it begin? Picture medieval Europe in the 14th century. You're a kingdom with a growing population, an economy that's starting to hum, and one enormous problem. You need stuff. Spices, silk, precious metals, all the good stuff that makes life worth living. But here's the catch. All of it has to come from the east, through a series of increasingly expensive middlemen who have been jacking up prices since the Roman Empire fell. During the High Middle Ages, the overland Silk Road was the primary route for Asian goods to reach Europe. But by the late Middle Ages, that route was becoming problematic. The Mongol Empire, which had kept the trade routes relatively safe, was fragmenting. The Ottoman Empire was rising and, crucially, taking control of key trade routes. By 1453, when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, they essentially told European merchants, great luck on your future endeavors, but the markup on pepper just went up 400%. So European powers had a choice. Either pay through the nose for Asian goods, find a new route, or develop alternatives. And if you're a 15th century monarch looking at your treasury, option 3 isn't really hitting right. There were actually earlier attempts to find sea routes to Asia. The Portuguese had been poking around the African coast since the 13th century, and by the early 1400s, Prince Henry the Navigator, actually let's talk about him for a second, because his nickname is absolutely hilarious when you think about it, was establishing a navigation school in Sagres, Portugal. Henry himself didn't do a ton of sailing. He was more of a venture capitalist for exploration, funding expeditions and collecting information. But Henry the Navigator sounds much cooler than Henry the guy who sat around funding other people's dangerous field trips. So here we are. There were other factors at play too. Technology had reached a point where long-distance maritime travel was becoming more feasible. The caravel, a small, highly maneuverable ship with both square and lateen sails, could sail efficiently against the wind, crucial for exploring down the African coast. The magnetic compass, the astrolabe, and improved cartography all helped. Europe was, essentially, inventing the tools it needed to become a global conqueror. And then there's the religious motivation. The Crusades may have ended in failure, but the desire to spread Christianity never really went away. Pope Nicholas V even issued a papal bull in 1455 called Dum Diversas, which basically gave Portuguese explorers permission to enslave any non-Christians they found. That's right, the Vatican literally gave a thumbs up to colonialism before colonialism was cool. It's not the best look, honestly. But the biggest driver, the thing that truly launched the age of exploration, was cold, hard cash. Spices were worth more than their weight in gold. The Portuguese figured out that if they could cut out the middlemen and get Asian goods directly, they'd make fortunes beyond imagining. And once one country started succeeding, everyone else wanted in on the action. This is what historians call the proto-globalization of trade, and it was about to get very, very intense. Let's take a quick breather, and if you're enjoying this journey through the age of exploration, now is a perfect time to hit that subscribe button and join the What Is community. We explore history, science, and the big questions that shape our world, and we'd love to have you along for the ride. There's more fascinating history coming up, so don't miss out. Next up, let's look at countries involved. The age of exploration wasn't a solo performance. It was more like an ensemble cast where everyone was trying to outdo each other while occasionally forming alliances and absolutely constant backstabbing. Portugal was first out of the gate, and honestly, they were the heavy favourites to win the exploration race. They had the geographic advantage, situated at the southwestern tip of Europe with easy Atlantic access, and they had Prince Henry's school pumping out skilled navigators like a very ambitious nautical diploma mill. By 1488, Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that yes, you could indeed sail around Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. The Portuguese then spent the next century building an empire based on controlling key maritime choke points, from Mozambique to Goa to Malacca. Their strategy was simple: dominate the spice trade and force everyone else to pay up. Spain was the other major player, and their entry into the exploration game came with a bit of an asterisk. See, when Columbus came knocking on the Spanish court's door in 1492, he was essentially a salesman with a very questionable product. He wanted to sail west to reach Asia. The problem was that his calculations were way off. He thought the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. Fortunately for him, Queen Isabella was tired of letting the Portuguese have all the fun and all the money. She funded his expedition, largely because she figured even if he was wrong, at least she'd get some islands out of the deal. And oh, did she get islands. Columbus stumbled into the Caribbean, starting a chain of events that would lead to the complete devastation of indigenous American civilizations. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Netherlands entered the scene a bit later, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, but they made up for lost time quickly. After gaining independence from Spain, the Dutch East India Company became perhaps the most powerful corporation in history. Yes, more powerful than some actual governments. They focused on trade, establishing posts across Asia, and eventually seizing control of much of Portugal's empire when the Portuguese started to falter. England and France also got in on the action, particularly in North America. The English had their famous privateers, legally sanctioned pirates like Sir Francis Drake, who were essentially given permission to rob Spanish ships on behalf of the crown. The French focused more on fur trading and relationships with indigenous peoples, though they ultimately lost most of their North American territory to the British. But here's what's worth remembering. These weren't just friendly competitions. There were actual treaties, actual wars, and an absolute ton of geopolitical maneuvering. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, negotiated by the Pope, because apparently the Vatican was in the mood management business, divided the newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal. The Portuguese got everything east of a certain line. The Spanish got everything west. It was a neat solution until everyone else started objecting, which, to be fair, was almost immediately. The competition between these nations would shape the next several centuries of world history. And it all started because a bunch of Europeans wanted cheaper pepper. Important moments, people, and discoveries. Alright, let's get into the good stuff. The age of exploration is absolutely packed with fascinating characters, improbable voyages, and moments that changed history. Let's hit the highlights. 1492. Columbus discovers. America. I put discovers in quotes because obviously people were already living there. But in terms of European awareness, this was the big one. Columbus, despite being wrong about basically everything geographically, accidentally landed in the Bahamas and then Cuba, convinced until his dying day that he'd found some sort of offshore islands near Asia. His voyages initiated sustained European contact with the Americas, which led to, what's the polite term? Significant cultural and demographic changes. We'll talk about the consequences later. 1498. Vasco da Gama reaches India. This was the big prize. By sailing around Africa and across the Indian Ocean, da Gama proved that the Portuguese could directly access the spice markets of Asia. His voyage was initially met with suspicion by the Zamorin of Calicut. Imagine someone showing up in your harbor with a bunch of weapons and asking to trade. But eventually, the Portuguese established themselves in India. The economic impact was enormous. Suddenly, those middlemen weren't needed anymore. 1513. Vasco Núñez de Balboa crosses Panama. Here's a fun fact. When Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and saw the Pacific Ocean, he was the first European to do so. He named it the South Sea because, well, it was to the south. Not the most creative naming, but honestly, after months of hacking through jungle, I think he earned a pass. 1519 to 1522. Magellan's expedition. Ferdinand Magellan's voyage is one of the most remarkable stories of the age of exploration, and also one of the most tragic. Magellan, a Portuguese sailor sailing for Spain, led an expedition to find a western route to the Spice Islands. He succeeded in crossing the Pacific, becoming the first European to do so, but was killed in the Philippines by a local chief, who frankly had excellent judgment about random strangers showing up with weapons. What's remarkable is that one of his ships, the Victoria, actually made it back to Spain in 1522, completing the first circumnavigation of the globe. Out of 270 crew members who set sail, only 18 returned, but they brought back enough spices to make the voyage profitable, which was really the only metric that mattered to the sponsors. 1524, Giovanni da Verrazzano explores the Atlantic coast. The Italian explorer, sailing for France, became the first European to explore the Atlantic coast of North America, between Florida and Newfoundland. His voyage established French claims to North America and provided detailed descriptions of the region that would later become the United States. 1532 to 1533. Francisco Pizarro conquers the Inca. This is where the age of exploration starts to get genuinely dark. Francisco Pizarro, a Spanish conquistador, led a small band of soldiers to overthrow the Inca Empire, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. Through a combination of superior weapons, strategic deception, and what can only be described as extreme biological warfare, the Spanish inadvertently introduced diseases like smallpox that devastated indigenous populations. The Inca were conquered within a few years. The gold alone that the Spanish seized was worth millions by modern standards. 1588, the Spanish Armada. Not strictly an exploration story, but hugely important. When Spain attempted to invade England, the English, utilizing faster, more maneuverable ships and taking advantage of bad weather, defeated the supposedly invincible Spanish fleet. This shifted the balance of naval power and opened the door for English and Dutch dominance in subsequent centuries. 1607 to 1735. The age of colonization expands. As exploration gave way to permanent colonization, Europeans established settlements across the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia. Jamestown, Plymouth, Quebec, São Paulo. These became the front lines of a new era where exploration was no longer enough. Now the goal was settlement, exploitation, and control. The discoveries made during this period were staggering, not just geographic, but botanical, zoological, linguistic, and cultural. Europeans encountered foods that would eventually transform global cuisine: potatoes, tomatoes, corn, chocolate, tobacco. They found new diseases that would also transform global health, just not in a good way. They mapped coastlines, charted currents, and created the first truly global understanding of Earth's geography. But as we'll discuss, this came at a price that we're still reckoning with today: how it ended. So when did this whole thing wind down? The answer is, it didn't so much end as evolve. The age of exploration, as a distinct historical period, is generally considered to have concluded by the late 17th century. Several factors contributed to this transition. First, the mapping was mostly done. By the 1600s, Europeans had a pretty good idea of where most of the major land masses were. There were still blank spots on the map. Australia's full coastline wasn't mapped until the 1600s, and Antarctica wasn't properly explored until the 19th century. But the era of "we have no idea what's out there" was largely over. Second, exploration gave way to colonization. The focus shifted from finding new places to exploiting the places already found. European powers established permanent settlements, created colonial administrations, and developed complex systems of trade and resource extraction. The question was no longer what's out there, but how do we make as much money as possible from what we've found? Third, the geopolitical landscape changed. The Netherlands, England, and France rose to challenge Spain and Portugal. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, is often cited as a symbolic endpoint because it recognized the sovereignty of independent states and effectively ended the old medieval order, where the Pope essentially decided who owned what. Fourth, the Enlightenment shifted priorities. By the 18th century, the intellectual climate was changing. The scientific revolution emphasized systematic knowledge over gold hunting. Exploration continued, but it was increasingly driven by scientific curiosity rather than pure economic gain. But here's the honest truth. The age of exploration didn't really end. It transformed. The impulse to discover, conquer, and exploit that drove European explorers in the 15th century didn't disappear. It just found new expressions. The colonial empires that emerged from the age of exploration would dominate global politics until the 20th century. The trade networks established during this period became the foundation of the modern global economy. And the ideological frameworks, Eurocentrism, the civilizing mission, the idea that European powers had the right to claim any land they discovered, persisted for generations. In a very real sense, we're still living in the world that the age of exploration created. Lasting effects. This is where things get serious, because the legacy of the age of exploration is complicated. Actually, complicated might be the understatement of the millennium. The Columbian Exchange. Let's start with something that's at least partially positive. The Columbian Exchange refers to the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, and diseases between the Americas and the Old World. New World crops like potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and peanuts transformed Old World agriculture and helped fuel population growth. Simultaneously, Old World diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza devastated indigenous American populations, killing an estimated 90% of Native Americans in the centuries following contact. There's no way to sugarcoat this. It was a demographic catastrophe on a scale rarely seen in human history. The Atlantic slave trade. One of the most horrific consequences of European exploration was the transatlantic slave trade. Starting in the 16th century and continuing for over 400 years, an estimated 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. The economic systems built on enslaved labor, particularly in sugar, cotton, and tobacco production, made some European nations incredibly wealthy, while devastating African societies and causing intergenerational trauma, whose effects persist today. The rise of the global economy. The trade routes established during the Age of Exploration created the first true global economy. Silver from the mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia flowed to China. Chinese porcelain arrived in European palaces. African slaves produced sugar that fed European appetites. The world became more interconnected than ever before, but the benefits were unevenly distributed. To put it mildly, European hegemony. Perhaps the most lasting effect was the establishment of European global dominance. By 1900, European powers controlled approximately 85% of the world's territory. This era of colonialism shaped everything from international borders to economic systems to cultural attitudes, and its effects are still visible today in issues ranging from political instability to economic inequality to cultural tensions. Cultural and scientific advances. On a more positive note, the Age of Exploration also led to enormous advances in navigation, cartography, astronomy, and shipbuilding. The knowledge gained during this period laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And the cultural exchanges, despite their often coercive nature, ultimately enriched human civilization in countless ways. The modern world. When you look at the world today, so much of what we take for granted has roots in the Age of Exploration. The foods we eat, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, coffee, all came from the Americas. The political boundaries of nations, particularly in the Americas and Africa, reflect colonial divisions. The English language itself is full of words borrowed from languages that explorers encountered. The globalized world we're living in? It started with a bunch of guys in wooden ships looking for a better deal on pepper. If this video sparked your curiosity about the age of exploration and its impact on our world, you'll love our deep dives into related topics. There's a playlist linked above. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you never miss a new video. History is full of stories that shape who we are today, and we're here to bring them to life. Thanks for watching. Bonus fact. And now for our bonus fact. The one piece of information that didn't quite fit into our main exploration, but is absolutely worth knowing. Here's something that surprises most people. The age of exploration almost didn't happen in the way we know it. In the early 1400s, China had the largest naval fleet in the world under the Ming Dynasty. Between 1405 and 1433, the famous Admiral Zheng He led massive maritime expeditions to Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and even East Africa. His ships were enormous. Some sources suggest they were up to 400 feet long, which would make them larger than most European ships for centuries to come. But then, in a decision that historians still debate, the Ming Dynasty abruptly ended the expeditions. China turned inward, focusing on domestic concerns and eventually implementing strict isolationist policies. The treasure ships were allowed to decay, and the navigational knowledge that had been gained was largely lost. So here's the thought experiment. What if Zheng He's voyages had continued? What if China had expanded its maritime empire instead of retreating? The entire history of the modern world might have been completely different, and we'd probably be watching videos about the Chinese age of exploration right now instead. It's a reminder that history isn't inevitable. Small decisions, or the absence of decisions, can change everything. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Imagine you're walking through the streets of Florence, Italy, in the year 1492. The air smells like stone dust and fresh bread. Around you, people are arguing passionately about whether a new painting is divine genius or dangerous blasphemy. A guy named Leonardo just finished a portrait that makes everyone weep at its beauty. And somewhere in a workshop, a 23-year-old Michelangelo is chipping away at a block of marble, convinced he's going to change the world. Now here's the wild part. None of these people call what they're living through the Renaissance. That word, Renaissance meaning rebirth, won't be invented for another 300 years. They're just living, making art, questioning everything, turning Europe upside down without even realizing it. So what exactly was this Renaissance? Why did it start in Italy of all places? And why does it still matter to you, watching this video on your phone right now? Let's find out. What exactly is the Renaissance? The Renaissance was a cultural, artistic, and intellectual movement that swept across Europe roughly between the 14th and 17th centuries. But here's the thing. It's not like someone woke up one morning and said, "All right, today the Middle Ages are over, let's rebirth." No, it happened slowly, like a caterpillar. But fancier. Think of it this way. The Middle Ages were like that friend who always plays it safe. Religious, traditional, cautious. The Renaissance was that friend's more adventurous roommate who said, "What if we actually looked at the world? What if we studied how bodies work, how light works, how people feel?" The Renaissance was fundamentally about returning to the classical learning of ancient Greece and Rome, the original cool kids of Western civilization, and then going way beyond them. It was about human potential, about asking why instead of just because the church said so. But, and this is important, the Renaissance wasn't a single event. It was a vibe, a mindset, a bunch of wealthy Italian city-states deciding that maybe, just maybe, they wanted to be more than just places where people farmed and prayed. Why Italy? The birthplace of a boom. Here's a question that bugs a lot of history students. Why Italy? Of all places, why did this explosion of genius happen in a boot-shaped peninsula that at the time wasn't even a unified country? The answer is basically, money, location, and a whole lot of ego. First, let's talk money. By the 14th century, Italian city-states like Venice, Florence, and Milan had become ridiculously wealthy through trade. They were the Amazon.com of medieval commerce, shipping spices, silks, and luxury goods across the Mediterranean. This new merchant class had money to burn, and they wanted to spend it on something other than more warehouses. They wanted prestige. They wanted their cities to look as amazing as ancient Rome once did. So they started funding artists, architects, and scholars, basically saying, "Make us famous." Second, location. Italy sat right in the middle of everything. It was the crossroads of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Ideas flowed through Italian ports like water through a fire hose. You had Muslim scholars sharing knowledge, Byzantine refugees bringing ancient Greek texts, and traders from every corner of the known world swapping stories and secrets. Third, and this is the fun part, Italian city-states were basically competing reality TV shows. Florence wanted to be fancier than Siena. Venice wanted to be richer than Genoa. Each city poured resources into looking better than its rivals. The result? An arms race of art, architecture, and genius. And here's a little secret. The Catholic Church was basically the biggest art patron of all. The popes wanted Rome to look as magnificent as possible, which meant hiring the best artists money could buy. When the papacy moved back to Rome after a century in France, it sparked even more artistic investment. Cha-ching. The arts, when painters became rock stars. Before the Renaissance, artists were basically skilled laborers. Useful, sure, respected, kind of. But nobody was putting them on magazine covers or writing fan mail. Then something changed. Suddenly artists weren't just craftspeople following religious orders. They were creators. They were geniuses. They were, dare we say it, rock stars. And the works they produced, they're still tourist magnets today. Let's run through the greatest hits. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa, the most famous smile in history, and The Last Supper, which basically invented the emotional close-up. He also dissected corpses to understand human anatomy better, designed flying machines, and made to-do lists that would make even the most organized person feel inadequate. We'll talk more about him later because honestly, he deserves it. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Yes, that one, lying on his back for 4 years, and sculpted David, which is basically a 17-foot-tall marble flex. He once said he saw the figure inside the marble and just had to chip away everything that wasn't David. No big deal. Raphael painted the School of Athens, showing all the great philosophers of antiquity hanging out together like a Golden Age TED Talk. His work was so perfect that later critics literally called it divine. Botticelli gave us the birth of Venus, where a goddess literally rises from the sea in a seashell. If that's not a music video concept, I don't know what is. What made these artists different? They weren't just copying religious iconography anymore. They were studying anatomy, perspective, light, and human emotion. They were making the sacred feel real. When you look at a Renaissance painting, you don't just see saints, you see people. Real people with real feelings, caught in real moments. And the audience noticed. Artists went from being called craftsmen to being called divine. Princes collected them. Kings fought over them. A painting by Leonardo was worth more than some small towns. They had groupies. Okay, maybe not groupies, but definitely very enthusiastic fans. The Renaissance man, doing it all and doing it well. If the Renaissance had a mascot, it wouldn't be a lion or an eagle. It would be Leonardo da Vinci. Why? Because Leonardo was the ultimate Renaissance man, a term that literally describes someone who's excellent at many different things. Writer, mathematician, engineer, musician, painter, inventor, anatomist, and occasional unicyclist. Okay, maybe not that last one, but wouldn't it be great if he was? The idea was simple. Why specialize when you can be extraordinary at everything? The Renaissance worshipped polymaths, people who believed that understanding the whole picture was better than just knowing one tiny piece. And Leonardo was the king of this. His notebooks are filled with sketches of flying machines, next to studies of water flow, next to jokes about priests. He was basically a walking Wikipedia article, if Wikipedia articles could also paint the Mona Lisa. But Leonardo wasn't alone. Filippo Brunelleschi was an architect who also figured out linear perspective, the mathematical way to make paintings look 3D, which basically revolutionized art overnight. Leon Battista Alberti wrote treatises on everything from architecture to cryptography to horsemanship. Even Michelangelo, despite being best known for sculpture and painting, also wrote poetry that was genuinely good. The Renaissance man wasn't just talented, he was curious. He believed that every subject was connected, that art could inform science, that engineering could inspire art, that understanding the past could change the future. And here's the wild part. This idea still shapes how we think about well-rounded education today. When your college insists you take classes outside your major, you're basically living the Renaissance dream. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, you're going to love our other videos. And subscribe if you haven't already, because more history goodness is coming your way. Next, the printing press, the medieval iPhone. Okay, let's talk about the invention that arguably changed humanity more than any painting or sculpture, the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg invented it around 1440 in Germany. And if you think that's boring, consider this. The printing press was basically the medieval iPhone. It connected people, spread ideas, and made information accessible to the masses. It also maybe, sort of, accidentally started a few religious revolutions, but we'll get to that. Before Gutenberg, every book was handwritten. This meant books were incredibly expensive, rare, and full of small errors, because humans are humans. If you wanted to read something, you either needed a lot of money, a lot of time, or a very patient monastery. Then came the press. Suddenly, books could be produced quickly, cheaply, and accurately. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's invention, there were printed books in every major European city. Within 100 years, more books had been printed than all the manuscripts produced in the previous 1,000 years. The implications were staggering. First, ideas spread fast. A new philosophical concept in Florence could reach London in weeks instead of years. Scientists could share discoveries across continents. Political pamphlets could mobilize populations. Second, literacy exploded. If you wanted to sell books, you needed readers. If you wanted readers, people needed to learn to read. Education became more accessible. The middle class started getting educated for the first time. Third, and this is the big one, the printing press helped the Protestant Reformation happen. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, a list of complaints about the Catholic Church, were printed and distributed across Europe in weeks. The Church couldn't suppress them because there were too many copies. The religious landscape of Europe was permanently changed. The printing press didn't just spread information, it democratized it. It gave ordinary people access to the same ideas that had once been locked away in palaces and monasteries. Invention, revolutionary, evolution, inevitable. The iPhone of its day, absolutely. Science and the new way of thinking. The Renaissance wasn't just about art and books, it was also about fundamentally changing how humans thought about the world and their place in it. For centuries, the Catholic Church basically held a monopoly on truth. Not just religious truth, all truth. If Aristotle said something was true and the Church agreed, then that was it. Questioning it wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. But Renaissance thinkers started asking different questions. Instead of, what does the Church say about this? They asked, what can I observe? What can I measure? What actually happens? This new approach had a fancy name, empiricism. It basically means learning through experience and observation, rather than just accepting what authorities told you. Nicholas Copernicus looked at the sky and said, wait a minute, what if the Earth isn't the center of the universe? His heliocentric model, placing the sun at the center, would eventually revolutionize astronomy, even though he was too scared to publish it until he was on his deathbed. Galileo Galilei pointed a telescope at Jupiter and discovered moons orbiting it, proving that not everything revolved around Earth. He was eventually put under house arrest for this, which tells you how threatening new ideas were to the established order. Andreas Vesalius dissected human corpses, gasp, to create detailed anatomical drawings that are still studied today. Before him, doctors relied on animal anatomy and ancient texts. He said, let's actually look inside a human body and see what's there. The Renaissance scientists weren't trying to overthrow religion. Many were deeply religious themselves. They just believed you could use observation and faith together. You could study God's creation while believing in God. This new way of thinking, let's call it skeptical curiosity, laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution that would follow. And that revolution gave us modern medicine, physics, astronomy, and basically everything else that makes the modern world work. How the Renaissance rewired Europe. So far we've talked about art, science, and printing, but the Renaissance didn't just change culture, it literally reshaped European society. Let's break it down. The rise of the individual. Before the Renaissance, you were born into your place in society, and that was that. The Renaissance celebrated personal achievement, individual talent, and personal glory. Want to be famous? Go out and earn it. This idea that you could define yourself through your actions rather than your birth would eventually fuel everything from the Protestant work ethic to modern entrepreneurship. The decline of feudalism. As cities grew wealthier and the merchant class gained power, the old feudal system, where lords owned everything and peasants worked the land, started to crumble. Trade networks replaced manor economies. Money replaced land as the measure of wealth. The birth of the modern state. Renaissance rulers needed to project power. They built armies, bureaucracies, and spy networks. They commissioned propaganda in the form of art and architecture. They created the foundations of the nation-state, the political unit that would dominate world politics for the next 500 years. Education for everyone. Well, everyone male and wealthy, but still. Schools and universities proliferated. Classical texts were taught alongside religious ones. Literacy rose. The idea that knowledge was valuable, not just spiritually, but practically, became mainstream. Religious upheaval. This one is huge. The Renaissance's emphasis on returning to original sources led scholars to read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, rather than just the Latin Vulgate. They asked, is this what the original text actually says? This critical thinking about religious texts was a direct precursor to the Protestant Reformation. Art becomes commerce. For the first time, artists could sell their work on the open market. They could compete for commissions. They could become famous and wealthy based on talent, rather than just guild membership. This market for art created the conditions for the star system we have today. The Renaissance didn't just change what Europeans thought, it changed how they lived. The end of the Renaissance and its legacy. Here's a question historians still argue about. When did the Renaissance end? Some say it faded gradually into the Baroque period, where art became more dramatic and emotional. Others say it died when the Protestant Reformation split Europe into warring religious camps in the 1500s. Some point to 1527, when troops sacked Rome and destroyed much of the city's artistic heritage. But here's the thing, the Renaissance didn't really end, it spread. Italian artists and ideas traveled north to France, Germany, England, and the Netherlands. The Northern Renaissance, featuring artists like Albrecht Dürer, Jan van Eyck, and Hans Holbein, had its own flavor, often more focused on detailed realism and religious reform than Italian humanism. And the ideas? They never really went away. The emphasis on observation, individual achievement, classical learning, and questioning authority became foundational to Western civilization. The Renaissance planted seeds that would bloom into the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the American and French Revolutions, and eventually the modern world. You want to know if the Renaissance is still alive? Look around you. You live in a world where individuals can become famous through talent and work, where books and information spread instantly, where scientists observe and experiment, where art is bought and sold in galleries, where universities teach critical thinking. That's the Renaissance. That's the legacy. It didn't end. It just became normal. Why it matters today. Let's bring this home. You're watching this video on a device that would seem like magic to a Renaissance artist. You have access to more information than any king in history. You can learn anything, communicate with anyone, create and share your own art with the entire world. That's not an accident. That's the Renaissance legacy. The Renaissance taught us that humans can achieve extraordinary things, that questioning received wisdom is a virtue, that looking at the world carefully, really seeing it, can reveal truths that change everything. It taught us that a florist's son from Vinci could become the most brilliant mind in history, that a poor sculptor from Caprese could carve beauty from marble, that a German inventor with a weird name could connect the world. And it taught us that culture matters, that art matters, that beauty and truth and knowledge are worth fighting for, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous, even when nobody's watching. The Renaissance isn't just a period in a textbook, it's a way of looking at the world. It's the belief that any of us, can make something extraordinary. So the next time you create something, learn something, or question something, just know that you're carrying on a tradition that started 600 years ago in the streets of Florence. You're a Renaissance person. Now go create something. So there you have it, the Renaissance from start to finish. If this video made you think, if it made you curious, if it made you appreciate that guy in the museum a little more, then do us a solid, share this video with a friend who's into history, or just someone who needs to know why Italy is shaped like a boot. Also, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we're constantly unpacking the stories behind the events that shaped our world. And if you've got a topic you want us to cover, drop it in the comments below. We read everything. Thanks for watching. Now let's get into that. Bonus fact. Here's something you probably didn't know. Michelangelo was so obsessed with the David that he reportedly kissed its fingers while working on it. And when the sculpture was finally unveiled in 1504, the entire city of Florence celebrated like they'd won the Super Bowl. They held a parade. They gave Michelangelo a lifetime pension. The entire population, estimates say around 10,000 people, flocked to see it in the first 2 weeks alone. That's like if every person in a small city waited in line for hours to see a single statue. Now that's star power.